So let me invite our next panel to join me on the stage. Tarja Jaakkola, Assistant Secretary General, Defence Industry, Innovation and Armaments for NATO. Welcome, Tarja.
Thank you, and good morning to everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me today. It's really great honor and pleasure to be back here in Bucharest. Actually, less than 6 months ago, we were here organizing together with the ACT and hosted by Romania, NATO Industry Forum, the ever biggest industry forum that we ever have had, more than 900 participants from governments and industry being here. So it was a very requisite event bringing together our defense industry government. And in November, actually what we said, we reiterated that industry is not just a partner, but an integral part of our deterrence and defense, and it actually underpins it. So it was very, very good for me to hear the earlier panel discussing about the private sector and the importance of private sector. So I have actually 3 topics that I would like to address. First, what are the NATO current priorities and how actually industry is part of that. And then talking a bit about the transatlantic defense industrial base. And since the title of our panel is Building Europe's Security Architecture, I thought I would also talk a bit about complementarity between NATO and EU and how that can benefit the alliance and our deterrence and defense. So looking at the NATO's current priorities, I'm sure you all are well aware that in June last year, the Ministers of Defense agreed new and significantly increased capability targets. And those targets are really ambitious, as you must have heard earlier. And those targets, of course, then were kind of followed on by the Hague Defense Investment Plan, where heads of state and government pledged to spend 3.5% on core defense and 1.5% on defense and security-related investments by 2035. So these 2 issues are interlinked. For allies and for allies to be able to meet their targets, they need to invest in defense, and of course, they need also to buy the defense capabilities for our collective deterrence and defense. So this is a question about the allies' rearmament and also working together closely with the industry so that the industry can deliver quantity and quality and at pace. And of course, like our Secretary General has underlined in several occasions, at the same time, we need to continue to support Ukraine. So when we look at the capability targets, I'm sure you must have heard our Secretary General saying that, for example, in the area of air and missile defense capabilities, the requirements are 5-fold higher than what were earlier. We are also talking about increase in terms of ammunition, tanks, armored vehicles, just to make a few examples. And I really need to commend Romania having taken decisive action over the last year to fulfill your urgent capability needs, including contracting, for example, new air defense systems. So what we are doing now at the NATO, and especially in my division, we are assisting our allies to the maximum extent possible so that they can meet these capability targets. So we, for example, have set mechanisms in place to aggregate demand and also to support nations procuring together, which could ultimately lead to a co-production and bringing those jobs and skills to Europe that the Executive Vice President mentioned earlier in her intervention. But we are also supporting nations to multinational capability development, and we are looking at identifying defense production bottlenecks and assess the risks that are in our supply chains. Critical raw materials is a good example, for example, where the nations are currently working together to multinationally procure and stockpile critical raw materials. But we are also working on standardization, which is a critical element for interoperability, and interoperability is critical in case we need to fight together. So we need to be interoperable. When I'm talking about industry, I'm not talking just about the traditional defense industry that produces the weapon systems, platforms, fighters, vessels, but also the new tech, the civilian side of the industry, where new innovation is coming up that can support nations to meet their capability targets and also at pace. So we are looking at areas like AI and autonomy, of course, very relevant. So then a few words about the EU-NATO cooperation and more capable European defense, interoperable with and complementary to NATO, makes our alliance stronger, contributes to the transatlantic burden sharing. We have 23 member states and allies that are the same. And of course, nations have single set of forces, but they also have single set of industry. So therefore, strengthening the defense capabilities of the EU allies, we also strengthen those of NATO. So when it comes to the new EU defense instruments, we very much welcome them. It supports our common members to bolster their industrial capacity, help them to meet their NATO capability targets. When we look at instruments like the Defense Industry Program, the European one, or the Security Action for Europe instrument. But at the same time, we have underlined by NATO that these instruments should be as inclusive as possible, and they should support cooperation among EU companies, but those of rest of our alliance. And we cannot really forget, if we look at the alliance, that we have an extensive industrial basis, not just on the other side of the Atlantic, but also when we talk about UK, Turkey, and for example, Norway. So we need to kind of utilize leverage on all of these. When we're looking at the EU and NATO, I quite often have said that we should build on the strength of these two organizations. NATO has a strong process to put together the capability targets. We have a military standardization, but EU has economic power and regulatory power as well. So what we need to do is build on our strengths and bolster practical cooperation in defense industrial matters. But we cannot forget our partners, countries like Ukraine or our 4 Indo-Pacific partners, Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea. We need to build cooperation with them as well. So to conclude, we are now preparing the Ankara summit, and our defense industrial cooperation will be in central role during the Ankara summit as well. We will be hosting the NATO Summit Defense Industry Forum that will further emphasize the important role of the industry is playing for our overall security. And of course, we in NATO continue delivering the deterrence and defense of our 1 billion citizens. And like our Secretary General mentioned, when the Romanian president recently visited the NATO HQ, NATO is to defend each inch of Allied territory. And now I will stop here.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Can I just ask one question also, just hasn't really been raised so far, just about cybersecurity and where Romania stands in this sense, because obviously this is highly relevant, especially for the energy sector. You know, since the start of the war in Ukraine, this is what is being targeted in Ukraine, in Moldova, elsewhere. And now we see Iranian operatives being pretty active in launching a whole series of cyber attacks. Albania is one country that's been hit, you know, its institutions in recent weeks. So where does Romania stand in terms of its cybersecurity defenses? Obviously, it's a matter for the private sector as well, not just for government, but just to...
So if we are discussing about cybersecurity, we cannot discuss only from the Minister of Defense perspective, because there are many institutions that can be attacked, and we are observing each day more than 10,000 attacks against our institutions. Inside Minister of Defense, we have a specialized, dedicated team who is taking care about our systems, and we are contributing to the others as well. So there are several institutions in Romania which are taking care about this threat. But from my perspective, and I think it's something we should address in a very clear way, that disinformation consequence creates a lot of troubles. And at the European level, we should very clear address that disinformation. So the discussion is not only around cyber attacks, the discussion should be also around the way the digital transformation is used in order to introduce fake news, in order to influence the perceptions about national very important aspects. And as a software engineer, I'm always saying that against algorithms, the only way to fight is also with the algorithms.
Thank you. Tarja, maybe I can come back to you now. Just ask you to comment quickly on a question now. These commitments have been made. We have the SAFE funds. There's budget, large percentage of European budgets now going towards defense. How can the member states ensure that these defense funds are spent on relevant and useful military equipment?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think it's also quite easy to answer, at least for me,
good.
representing NATO. We do have the NATO capability targets that the nations agreed on June last year, and that is capability targets that we need to keep the alliance and its population safe in the future. And now the nations need actually to implement those capability targets, to procure the systems and equipment that are needed for the deterrence and defense of the alliance. And of course, I've been very pleased to hear in several occasions Commissioner Kubilius saying that the intention of the EU is also through the different EU instruments to help the joint 23 nations to implement their capability targets. Because like I said earlier, the nations have only a single set of forces and single set of capabilities and single set of industry as well. So this is one of the ways to do that. And then also what we have very much underlined is also multinational collaboration, both in procurement and capability development to increase interoperability. And also that is one way of also addressing the fragmentation the minister mentioned earlier, because the fragmentation is not just on the supply side, it's on the demand side as well. And so that is also, I think, one of the key elements to procure jointly. And what we also have underlined to our EU colleagues when we have had interaction with them is that we have a lot of activities ongoing already within NATO when it comes to capability development. So we would need to ensure that we are complementary and also look actually in which domains perhaps the safe loans or the EU instruments could be used to pursue those projects that we already have in place in the NATO context.